Watkins Glen. Today, as a lunchtime entertainment for Saturday, we're having a roundtable on the state of motorsport history. We've gotten together a nice group, but it's very important to understand that we will talk a lot, but we want you to know why we're here in the first place. About 10 years ago, exactly, Amy Bass in the American, the Journal of American History had an article on the cultural turn in sport history. Mike Argensinger and I were very taken by that. We'd already been plotting and scheming to have something evolve from the center conversations that were going on. And we decided that we'll make it happen. And we finally got support from the governing council, as it was called, the board of directors. And then, unfortunately, Mike's illness came back. And before we could do anything, he passed away. We had decided to name it after his mom, Jean Argensinger, because she's the person who made the International Motor Racing Research Center happen. Believe me, having been one of those people that was tagged by Miss Jean to be part of the crew, boom, she made it happen. So that's why we're here. We want to talk about what the state of the motorsport history is. The people I've got right now, I'm going to start off with Mark Howell. He's a professor of communications at Northwestern Michigan College, way up in Traverse City, Michigan, fighting with Haggerty people every day over the insurance race, I'm sure. Got his doctorate from Bowling Green State University, one of the cultural guys. This is one of the books of the academic motorsport community. This puppy came out in 1997. From Moonshine to Madison Avenue, Cultural History of the NASCAR Winston Cup Series is a landmark. There had been a gap between any real academic works on motorsport. This one, I think, opened a lot of doors to people. The Bowling Green, I'm trying to, I never get Popular Press published it, which bless your hearts, because it really, it's a great book. I cannot push it hard enough. It really shook a lot of us up because, wow, we can talk about this. We can do notes. We can, we got enthused about it. There are others that followed that. Another book that he has edited along with John Miller in Longwood University in Farmville, Virginia, is a great anthology. This is one of those books. If there's a motorsport class, this is just one of the textbooks that you have. The authors are great. It's just a great variety, and the academic approaches are just superb. One of our saviors when we started the Argensinger Symposium was Paul Baxa. He fell out of the sky on us when we really needed somebody. Paul is at Ave Maria University down in Florida. Ave Maria, as a matter of fact. It's a wonderful place. If you get a chance and you're in the area, if you go to Revs, you got to go out to Ave Maria. It's a beautiful setting, absolutely top-notch. His first book, one I like a lot because it's something I'm very interested in as well. It's called Roads and Ruins, a symbolic landscape of fascist Rome. I'm a roadside architecture guy, and this is super duper stuff. The Toronto University Press published it, and I really can't say enough. It really kind of blew my mind It's what, 2010, I think it was when it came out. But now here's the coup de grace, as they say. Um, Motorsport and Fascism, Living Dangerously. We kind of saw this book come together over time. And here is what makes this book so darn good. Whether it's in Italian or in English, this is one of the very few works, scholarly or otherwise, that addresses the relationship between the fascist in Italy and sport in the form of motorsport. It's super duper. Uh, I can't say enough about it. It really is a unique work, and I think that's going to open doors for things. There's only one other book that I'm aware of, and I have to go right here to get it, that comes close. And this is by one of my compatriots, Alf Deutsch, Uedai, uh, Superfelfel and Hagenkertz, Auto Rennsport im National Socialist. And it is another, these are the only two books that address these topics in an academic, scholarly manner. There are others out there, but these are the two that really dig in there and do the analysis and the research. So we're very fortunate for that. One of the things that I'm delighted is that Brandon Gracian, who has produced the book we're going to talk about almost right off the bat. Mark's going to take up after I shut up. Speed Capital, Indianapolis Auto Racing, and the Making of Modern America. I'm a sucker for anything that's the making of modern America. I'll be very truthful about that. That is one of the things, particularly with motorsport involved. We talked about that, but he also has a great journal article, the Journal of Sport History, NASH. If you aren't a member of NASH, you need to seriously consider it. I've been one for God knows forever, it seems. Uh, in the spring 2023 issue, volume 50, number 1, which I thought was pretty cool. He visits a topic that we here at the Argensinger have visited in different way. It's annihilating space, motorsport, and the commodification of movement. Very much involved in line with some of the things we've done in the past. And it's a great article. It is super to read. One of our former members of the community, Scott Beekman, he said, now notice what I'm going to say. Rio Grande University in Rio Grande, Ohio. NASCAR Nation, A History of Stock Car Racing in the United States. Super book. Came out in 2010. And I think, Mark, you'll probably agree, this is one of the really good ones. It hits it, and it doesn't pull punches about a lot of things. It is it's a companion in a certain way with real NASCAR. Dan Pierce's book. Dan Pierce is at University of North Carolina, Asheville. Super guy. White Lightning and Fred Clay and Big Bill France. This is University of North Carolina Press, and it's a very popular book. Both of these, I think, appeared simultaneously at the same time even, and they do a great job of putting an academic aspect to an American, I'd say uniquely, since they do have it in Canada, American sport, but the way we do it. There's a lot of other anthologies out there. There's one at Routledge does a number of these things. The History of Motorsport, which is worth really looking into. And then there's this big fat one, The History and Politics of Motor Racing. It covers a lot of space, and it's a typical Palgrave Macmillan book. worth getting it. One of the other people that got me started, Pete Daniels, used to be at the National Museum of American History. I had the opportunity to actually talk with any, by the way, one of the things in the book he talks about in stock car racing, but anybody who devotes space to Sputnik Monroe has got to be a good guy. If you don't know Sputnik Monroe, you're lost. Anyway, the other person that I would like to have here, but it will be there. It will be in person as we're recording this. Is a great friend of ours, a great friend of the symposium, Dr. Dan Simone. Dan was another one of those inspired by what Mark did. His dissertation, got his doctorate at the University of Florida, which is a unique thing to do since nobody really knew what he was doing. So he got away with it. I love that. And he was the curator at the NASCAR Hall of Fame Museum in Charlotte for about a dozen years. He was one of those that got the shape, the atmosphere. I think that's the word I'm looking for. Uh, Public history is a piece of this that I think it's overlooked. And I think it's important that that comes up. And I think that Dan and I will talk about that in person to a degree. But anyway, I've talked enough, and I hope everybody now got their box lunches and sitting there and ready to enjoy it. At this point, I will toss it over to the esteemed Dr. Mark Howell to introduce and talk with Brian Gracie about his book because we are really excited about this thing. Mark.
Thank you, Don. And hello, everyone. Wish I could be there in person, but we've had a bit of a tightening of the purse strings of professional travel funding at my institution. So I will be coming to you. And I think if this is at lunchtime on Saturday, you would have just heard me complete my presentation first thing on Saturday morning. But it's an honor to be here with Brian and with Paul and with Don, as always, to talk about what is a most fascinating look at, I want to say, automobile history, but I also want to say motorsports history. I also want to say regionalism. I want to say American culture, because what Brian has done with Speed Capital is he has created this truly, purely interdisciplinary look at something that to most people, they only have maybe a recollection of Indianapolis through what they see in the sports pages. Don, as you were saying, so much motorsports history came through journalism and came through people who wrote about racing as reporting on the event or telling the stories of the people who built the cars, who drove the cars. They talked about those particulars. But what Brian has done is he has branched out and sort of taken us from that sort of microscopic look at Indianapolis as a racetrack and taken us far afield to look at how Indianapolis came to be, not just the speedway, but how the community came to be, how this little village along wagon trails in rural frontier Indiana turned into the commercial and political center that it did, what it meant to the development of the Midwest, and then ultimately how four very enterprising businessmen with a vision and with some property at their disposal ended up creating what is arguably the most iconic and most famous use of space for sport in the entire world. everyone everywhere knows Indianapolis. Even if you're not a race fan, you know the Indianapolis 500. You know the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. And so that's where Brian's book, I think, has really sort of reinvented this idea of what we as historians, and most importantly, as academic historians, can bring to a subject like motorsports. It doesn't just have to be the cars, the tires, the drivers, the mechanics, the events. It can be this broader perspective on the communities, the founders, the fans, like Scott does and like Dan did, with their books on NASCAR, looking at sort of the culture, looking at the people who made the sport what it is, and then looking at the people who are sustaining the sport. That idea that there's more to motorsports history than just motorsports. And so that's what attracted me to Brian's book. That's what thrilled me when I was reading it. I know it sounds cliche, but the idea of I couldn't put it down. That's exactly, not many books have that kind of effect on a jaded old historian like me. But Brian's book, I truly could not put it down, because every page, as we were saying about the interdisciplinary nature of it, every page brought something new to the study, brought something new to the discussion, and those twists and turns that ultimately lead to the most famous racetrack on the planet, and what that track means, not just in terms of competitive nature, but in terms of human nature, and in terms of popular culture and American culture and global culture. This book really hits each and every one of those highlights. And so, Brian, it's a pleasure to have you here with us. It's an honor to have you here, and we hope that we can have a really good discussion here about your work and what it means to not only the motorsports community, but to that larger academic history with the capital H community. So yeah, let's go ahead and talk Indianapolis.
Thanks for those kind words. I appreciate it.
Brian, I'm fascinated about how your previous book was on college football, which I'm sorry to say I haven't read yet. After reading Speed Capital, that's on my list of books to grab. What was it about Indianapolis that prompted you to take on this project?
I have a story I like to tell, and I've probably told it too many times. But what happened is, I was off doing dissertation research in 2005 and 2006. I spent some time in the San Francisco Bay Area, spent some time in Ann Arbor, Michigan, spent some time in Boston. And in the process, as I was researching about college football stadiums, things like that, some of the things that show up in my first book, I really decided, and it's funny because I grew up in a small town, kind of small city in central Illinois. We never went to cities when I was a kid. I started realizing that I really liked cities. And especially Boston. I like the public transportation and just kind of the energy of the city. And I got back to Champaign, Illinois, where I was doing my dissertation, where I was doing my PhD. And I said, man, I kind of miss cities, and the easier thing for me to have done, or the logical thing for me to have done, would be to drive up to Chicago or take the train up to Chicago and do Chicago stuff. But I realized Indianapolis was a little bit closer to Champaign, Illinois, and it was a little easier to drive to and park your car. And so I would periodically go over to Indianapolis, do Indianapolis kind of stuff. And one time I was there in the summer of 2007. So this is like 17 plus years ago. I drove past the Speedway, because coming in from on I-74, you used to go right past the Speedway, which I had seen before. It wasn't the first time I'd seen it. And I realized, oh, I'm writing this chapter all about football stadiums. And I don't know how this 250,000 seat stadium essentially ended up here in Indianapolis. I was like, I wish I knew more about that. And then it was that day I realized that the Speedway is not in Indianapolis proper. It's in a place called Speedway, which used to be Speedway City, Indiana. I'm sure some of you are familiar with that. And that day I said, I need to go read the best thing that's ever been written, best academic thing that's ever been written about Speedway City, Indiana. And I went and looked and nobody had done it. I said, oh, that's interesting. Now I need to go read the best thing that's ever been written, academic thing that's ever been written about the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Went to find it and I said, nobody's done this. And I just kind of started doing, the preliminary, like going down the rabbit holes on Wikipedia and whatever about like who built this thing and why they did it. And I started learning about Carl Graham Fisher, which again, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Carl Fisher, the guy who essentially built the Speedway, among other things. And I said, there's a book here. There's a really interesting book here. And it's what I started thinking about was how the work that's been done, I pretty quickly figure out the work that's been done about Carl Fisher. It's mostly about Miami Beach because he's known for Miami Beach. His papers are at the Miami History Center there at the Dade County Public Library. And I realized, oh, everybody focuses so much on Carl Fisher and Miami Beach that they're missing out on what is, I would like to say, is the center of his automotive empire. And that's Indianapolis. That's the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. And I said, there's a story here about this guy who builds a racetrack built on headlight money, right? Headlamps, sells it out to Union Carbide, makes the money, and then builds a racetrack, and then also builds the highways and builds Miami Beach, Florida, and builds, tries to build Montauk Point, Long Island, and then, his empire collapses in the 1930s. And that's a long-winded answer to say that's really what got me going, was learning about Speedway City, Indiana, and Carl Fisher, the guy who kind of pulls, he's the central node in, like I said, this kind of automotive empire of the early 20th century.
And that's welcome to the club. That is such an origin story, I think, that we all in our own careers have experienced. Hey, what's that? And then you fall down, as you say, the rabbit hole of research, and you start finding all of these loose ends, but then you find that none of those loose ends have been tied up by anybody, and suddenly there's a story there to tell, and like you say, Carl Fisher is obviously the name that goes with the Speedway, but that idea of him, to branch away from the motorsports, the idea of him being someone who manipulated space and nature to create not just the Speedway, but what you say about his creation of Miami Beach, filling in, taking land and making islands and reshaping the natural landscape to make it an entertainment location, yeah. which he did with the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. You could argue that that's an entertainment location, and that idea of how much more he meant and how much more his partners meant in terms of, as you say, the creation of highways and roads, the idea that government gravitates, and business gravitates to Indianapolis. Yeah, it's a marvelous story. Yeah, once again, welcome to the club.
One of the things I think that's really fascinating about Fisher is, we talk so much about how he builds Miami Beach from a sandbar into Miami Beach. I'm convinced that he learns how to manipulate space and how to build things through the Speedway. That's really his first experience with reshaping land. In this case, for a spectator facility, right, a motorsport facility, and he takes, I think, some of those things he learns in Indianapolis, and then he takes it down to Miami Beach and builds Miami Beach into this kind of tourist center, right? That you pretty much have to drive there in order to get there. And something occurred to me as I was working on, probably took 12 years or so this occurred to me, that we always talk about Henry Ford. Henry Ford's the guy that taught Americans to love cars. And there's probably some truth to that, right? But Henry Ford was the guy who he mastered the production of automobiles. And I think that Carl Fisher, in some ways, he's almost as important as Henry Ford, but he taught us about consuming automobiles, not just buying them and driving them, but about how to enjoy them, right? You need, if you're going to enjoy your automobiles, you need roads, you need places to drive to, you need, a spectacle. And he created that in a way that Henry Ford, of course, early on in his career, Henry Ford did a little bit of auto racing, but he was always the guy who was like, if he gets money, he's going to plow it back into his factory. If Carl Fisher gets money, he's going to build a fun place, or he's going to build an auto racing, speedway or something. And so I think that we need to talk, I like to say Carl Fisher's as important as Henry Ford. He's probably not. But we need to talk about Carl Fisher as somebody kind of on an equal plane in a lot of ways to Henry Ford in terms of teaching Americans and teaching the world how to consume automobiles.
Yeah, one of the things, Brian, you mentioned, and I think Mark pretty well nailed it as well, is the fact that you talked about you started looking. And I had mentioned, to you privately, that there's this linear meters of books on Indianapolis, the 500, the Speedway, whatever. But when you start peeling back that onion, yeah, I mean, God, it may be kilometers for all I know. You find not much there of substance. That's what made this, to me, fascinating, because you did what some of us didn't have the sense to do. You pulled that together, and I like that. I think you're hitting on that. The whole business with Fisher makes sense, and it's always puzzled me. I got into some Indiana, Indiana roots, and it's like, how did this get here? Type of deal. And it is, people forget it was a major locale in that time period. It may have been passed by, but it's good. So yeah, that to me is very fascinating, and how you did that out from there. Yeah. Where would you have us look now based upon what you're doing? Where do we need to go next with Speed Capital?
That's a good question. And I'm going to go back to something you said a minute ago about the meters, the kilometers worth of books. I hate to admit it, I didn't read all those before I wrote my book. I've read some of them, in the process. And I think when I have read some of those books about Indianapolis, they're so focused on the cars and the races that I'm not saying it wouldn't have helped me to read more of those, but at a certain point, it was like I want to break out of that mold, right? And one of the things like I realized, I mean, what's the nickname for the Indianapolis Motor Speedway? It's the Brickyard, right? And what you have to realize, I think, if you look at a track like the Speedway, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, if you just look at the cars, you're only looking at roughly half of the technology, right? Because there's a lot of other technology that goes into making a speedway into a really, really interesting place. It's the automobiles, it's the tires, but it's also things like the bricks that they put down on the track, or whatever the pavement is on the track. It's the lights surrounding it so that you can have events at night. Early on in the Speedway's history, the first events were balloon contests. They were aviation contests with airplanes. And some people, some good historians who have written about that, just kind of dismiss those things. They go, well, that was just a publicity stunt. That was just a way Carl Fisher was trying to get people interested in his auto races. And I looked at it, I said, no, I don't think that's what he's doing at all. I think he's creating the Speedway as a place to demonstrate all these, what I call what they called space annihilating technologies. And if you just act like those are publicity stunts and you kind of like forget about them and you just focus on the cars, you're missing the idea that at least before World War I, up to about 1917 or 1918, the Speedway is probably, I won't say it's as much about aviation as it is about automobiles, but it's like maybe a third about aviation. And it's about these technologies of getting people more quickly from place to place in the modern era. And that's one of the things modernity is all about, is using technology, I think, to limit the strictures of time and place. And Fisher's kind of a master at that. And I think that the Speedway is a good representation of those changes happening in the early 20th century.
Yeah, and I
I'm
find
gonna throw, go ahead, Paul.
you sure? Okay, sorry. Yeah, Brian, once again, just a great book, very rich, fertile in ideas. It's amazing. But yeah, the connection between auto racing and aviation, I think, is something you bring out really well. And that's where Rickenbacker then kind of comes in the 20s. And so I thought you did that really well. But the thing about the competition history, you do bring that in. And one thing I really love about your book is you talk about the context and all these different factors like urban planning and aviation and everything else. But you always come back to the races, and you always have a little section in each chapter on 1916. This is what happened. 1921, 22. And I really like that. So I think, because that's one of the big challenges with writing sports history is you don't want to be too journalistic. You don't want to get into just the anecdotal and what happened on the field or on the track. But you can't really ignore that either. I mean, it is important. And so the way you weave the two together, I thought was outstanding. But one other thing that I wanted to say, what I really liked about your book is how you trace the nostalgic impulse beginning in the 30s. That there's a point in the 30s where the Indy 500 or the promoters start to look back on the event itself. It's just kind of meta history, if you will, of the event itself, and they start to promote their history. And I thought that was really brilliantly done. So I wrote a review of your book as well, so it'll be out soon, and it's a glowing review. But yeah, those are some of the things that I really liked about it.
Yeah, and if I can respond to a couple of those things.
Yeah.
So trying to remember the first thing you were saying before you went to
Aviation.
Oh, it's the actual racing.
Yeah.
My original thought when I was writing the book is it was going to be much more about Speedway City and urban planning and those kinds of things, and it was going to be much less chronological. And as I started working, I started saying, if there haven't been a lot of academic works on auto racing, I mean, I know there's some NASCAR stuff, right, and some other things. I've actually learned about some of them from Don. I need to go reread or read some of these. I said, at a certain point, I think we just need to tell the story of the races, and go through newspaper accounts and as best as I can construct what happened at those races. And it was kind of fun because you start to see how much faster things are getting, when we're talking a 130 mile per hour lap, a race, speed, I guess, a race, as opposed to like an 80 mile an hour race. That's a huge difference. And we see those things happening, and each race kind of people talk about it in different ways, and that changes over time. But the nostalgia thing, again, that's something that wasn't supposed to be in the book. I originally thought I was going to end this maybe sometime in the post-World War I period, 1920s. My first book more or less ended around 1929 or so, and then I pushed it a little bit later. And what happened was it was one of those weird serendipity moments where a few years ago I was at an estate sale. This is probably before the pandemic. I was at an estate sale in Amarillo, Texas, big house, apparently a doctor at the local VA hospital. And they had like an entire, a very complete run of Sports Illustrated from like the 1950s to the 1970s. It was like 20 or 25 years of Sports Illustrated. And I spent probably 45 minutes just going through them, and they were $2 a piece or something. And one of the ones I bought it had Eddie Matthews, the famous Atlanta Braves slugger on the cover. And I said, well, my uncle sorry, not Atlanta Braves, Milwaukee Braves. He was a Milwaukee Braves fan. My uncle was. And I said, I'll buy him this copy of Sports Illustrated, and he'll enjoy it from like 1957 or something like that. And I took it home and I got looking at it and I go, oh, there's part one of a 2-part series about the Speedway and about the new owner, Tony Holman. And as I got reading it, and they're talking about the museum and how the museum's getting built. The original one gets built in the 50s. The present one was built in the 70s, around the time of the bicentennial, which of course is an important time for museums. And I started reading, I said, oh, this is where the book needs to end. It needs to end with the building of the museum in the 1950s and kind of how people are looking back with nostalgia to this kind of golden sports in the 20s. And then once I had kind of figured that out, then I start reading all the stuff in the 30s. And I said, oh, the nostalgia's there before they ever build the museum. Yeah. It even starts, I would say, a little bit after World War I, but you can really feel it coming into play in the 1930s during the Great Depression. The Speedway's been around for about 20 years or so. It survived World War I. It survived stock market crash. And now people are starting to look back at it as this thing that's been there. It's been around. And that's also right about the same time that the Baseball Hall of Fame is getting started in the 1930s. It is this kind of, the 1930s is this time period where, because of the Depression, people are looking forward to the future. They're anticipating the future, but they're also looking back kind of fondly to the past before modernity collapsed, essentially in the 1930s. And I think the Speedway is just such a good illustration of how that develops. It's not the only sport where it happens, but it's a
Sure.
really, really important one, I think, for understanding.
And that's where your book really fits our overall sort of scope of automobile history and motorsports history, because so much of motorsports is rooted in some form of nostalgia. We remember those great old drivers and those great old car builders, and we remember the famous races, and we can all hearken back to where we were when this event happened, or what got us interested in a particular kind of motorsport. So much of studying racing, just like history itself, is really based on that sort of fascination with nostalgia. Remember when. And racing really sort of prides itself in that, because you can look at an automobile from the 19 teens, the 1920s, that raced at Indianapolis. You can go and actually see one. You can actually go and see, you can go to the NASCAR Hall of Fame and see a stock car that competed on the beach at Daytona in the mid 1950s. That's it. It's there. And it's not just that nostalgia, but there's the artifact right there. You can see it, and you can, if you had to, you could go over and touch it, and that's that. And again, to dovetail on what Paul said, yeah, that idea of, at some point we start sort of hearkening back, and that idea of, who who was the first two-time winner, who was the first three-time winner, who was the first one to break 100 miles an hour, and you just start kind of swimming in all of that fascinating data that ultimately throws you back to that idea of, this is our connection to that history. This is where we actually become part of it.
Right, and it's an interesting
Paul,
tension.
yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Paul.
Sorry, Don. It's an interesting tension too, because motorsport is about progress, as Brian's book shows. Right, every year there's an increase in speed, so it's a forward-looking sport, but yet you have this draw to the past as well, and there's always a tension, I think, in motorsport between those two things. So,
And I would say by the time they actually create the museum, or not long after they create the museum in the 1950s, one of the things I say in the book is that a race car is pretty much, it's a historic relic.
Yeah.
A year or two. That's not necessarily the case in 1909, but by the 1960s, I mean, as soon as you run one of these cars, the technology has already passed it by. And I think that's one of the things that's so interesting about motorsport nostalgia, is that this technology is moving so quickly that it does almost kind of so quickly turn the recent past into the past.
Yeah,
I think,
and one of the things that Paul hit, it's funny how great minds think alike here. Thank you, Paul. With that whole business of nostalgia, of something that I kept seeing here, there, and yonder, was Indianapolis was an interesting aspect of Americana, in that it's the only race after the teens that the Europeans even basically knew existed well into the 60s. I mean, it took a while for the US Grand Prix, for instance, but but Indianapolis has this nostalgia for when the French came over, and that, in 13 and 14 and all that. And then you have Indianapolis adopting the international, Formula International for a time. And then in 38, it's the Grand Prix Indianapolis. It runs a Grand Prix formula. I mean, Italiano, you have a Maserati, and by the way, I'm a Maserati guy, comes over, and they do very successful, because someone was very clever and said, I think this can happen. We can make this. But that goes back to something that Paul hit. There was this nostalgia for this international connection that got lost. And I think he kind of get on that. And man, I think that's part of what this whole cultural thing that we get involved with, is that there was a culture that had created in Indianapolis that always had this outward reach to Europe. I mean, yeah, I just find it fascinating because, even when you have the production-based formula from what, 30 to 37, you still have a European interest. Not necessarily great, but people are writing about it. People are looking at it. The Italians took it very seriously. I know that. I mean, that's one of the reasons that they were able to do that. But yeah, and that goes back to again, Brian, this holistic cultural approach that you took. As Mark pointed out, all these little dots start connecting. That nostalgia that the two of you have talked about, that becomes an important part of this, the remembrance, if you will, of that. So that to me, and this conversation has really kind of sharpened some of my ideas about it. That's really the sort of book every time I pick it up, I start flipping through it or find something like, oh, where did that come from? I thought I'm reading the words differently.
That
So,
that's quite a compliment. I mean, I just want people to read it. So if you pick it up and read it, look at it again. That's
yeah.
even better.
I've already read it 4 times, so yeah.
Um, I think what you're saying about the international dynamic is really interesting because that's something that's in there, but it wasn't really
Right.
stressed. But you're absolutely right. Depending on where we're at in time, right? Pre-World War I is different from, say, the 1920s and 30s. But I think there's also kind of a regional nostalgia that comes into play there. You were saying earlier that Indianapolis is an early manufacturing center for automobiles, certainly before 1932 or 33, before the Great Depression. Indianapolis, it's not quite Detroit, but they're making a lot of cars there. And then the Depression pretty much kills off Indianapolis's auto industry, other than maybe some parts manufacturing in central Indiana. And there's probably reasons for that. But in a weird way, the death of the auto industry long term is probably a good thing for Indianapolis. Because if you compare it to Detroit, what happens to Detroit, right? I mean, Detroit, it is the giant of American auto manufacturing. And at a certain point in the 1970s and 80s, that more or less kills off Detroit, right? With all due respect to people who live in Detroit and love Detroit, I know there's people who love it as a city, but it gets so focused on producing automobiles, the Henry Ford production and so forth, that's all it can do. And what happens at a certain point is Indianapolis isn't producing automobiles by and large after the 1930s. And instead, they're focused on the spectacle and they get focused on the nostalgia and they get focused on kind of the symbolism of automobiles as much as the actual production of automobiles. And at a certain point, what it seems to me like happens is Indianapolis, it takes kind of a postmodern turn at a relatively early date, right? Where instead of continuing focusing producing the cars, we're going to produce a spectacle that's about cars that's going to build the mystique of this place to the point where by like the 1970s, Indianapolis is making a conscious decision. We're going to, part of our focus in terms of building the economy of this place, it's going to be about sport. It's going to be about professional sport. It's going to be about amateur sport. And you look at Indianapolis history in terms of sport, yeah, they've got, I mean, now they have a couple of big league teams in terms of football and basketball. But they, they do the Pan Am Games in 1987. The NCAA has its headquarters there now. It's a speedway, of course, goes back far. And I think that Indianapolis, in some ways, kind of get in more so than most Midwestern cities. It kind of gets out ahead of that change in the economy. That it's no longer just about producing things, but it's also about producing, I don't know, media spectacle and an automotive spectacle. I hope that
That's a very good point. Yeah, because other than baseball, it had a AAA team there forever and ever and ever. The sports explosion seems to be tied very directly to the ability of all these people coming in with their different sports to the speedway and the expertise that has been built up over time and so forth. I want to read something that there's a book that has bothered me for ever since it came out. Stephen Reese is one of the gods in Nash. Got it. I've talked to Stephen a couple of times. I even hit him on this one. It's in a series called the American History Series. It's Sport Industrial America, 1850 to 1920. One of the few automobile-related things that gets mentioned is Indianapolis. And on page 44, he says, car racing remained a significant sport in the 1920s, but the automobile's primary role in sport was primarily transporting fans to ball games and golfers to the links. I've never forgiven Stephen for that, as accurate as it may be. But that, I think, sums up why I was so taken with your book, because it's, I would say, a antithesis of that, but it plays off that very much so, because without the automobile, there is no speedway.
Steve and I had a bit of an exchange one time. He was editing something I had written for something he was editing, a volume of some sort. And I said something about the Speedway was a suburban venue. And he's like, no, it's in the city. And I was like, not in 1909, it wasn't. It's 4 miles from downtown. I mean, today it's kind of surrounded by the city, but it wasn't when they built it. And I think what's interesting, what you just said, that about it being kind of people driving to sports, I think that I really believe that like the Speedway is like the prototypical suburban stadium, the place that you drive to see sport. Like you don't really have that before 1909. And what is it? It's a place not just you drive there and you watch sport. It's not to watch baseball or football. You drive there to watch sport of the technology that took you to the place. And I think that's so. Why haven't we talked about that? Why haven't all the sport historians who talk about stadiums and suburbanization of stadiums, people like Steve Reese, why don't they talk about the fact that really the first place where you can do that is an automotive speedway built like 5 years, I can't remember exactly the year of the Model T, but it's like the year after the Model T is introduced or something, right? 5 years is, I'm thinking of the first automobile in my city of Amarillo, Texas, shows up in 1904, and then within 5 years, you've got this speedway in Indianapolis. And then going back to something Paul said earlier, kind of where do we go from here? I would say one of the things that surprised me the most when I was doing the research was like every city in America had a speedway. There's like a moment, not every city, but a lot of cities between like 1910 and like 1917, like right before World War One. Omaha, Des Moines, Amarillo, Texas, where I live, had a couple of different speedways for a couple of years.
Brooklyn. That's just, you're talking my home here. Okay.
And I think that in some ways, the success of the automobile in the 1920s sort of kills off speedway racing, except at just a couple of places, right? Like Indianapolis. And I think that by one of the things that occurred to me as I was researching, writing the book, I said, we need to know a lot more about these kind of little speedways that disappear after 5 or 10 years. Why is there this huge boom in the 19-teens? And then it kind of disappears. And I think that's part of the reason why nostalgia is so important for Indianapolis, is because there's nobody else hardly in the United States that's doing this until of course you get NASCAR and midget car racing and some of these other types of, later Formula One, I think, is coming to the United States. I admit, I don't know. I can't tell you all the years that these things happen, but Indianapolis is kind of the place that's left. They're left standing. And there's a couple moments where the Speedway almost got turned into something else. It almost becomes an airport. It almost becomes a suburban housing development a couple times. There's several times where they could have taken that land, divested it, turned it into something else. And basically what happens is by the 1940s, by the time Tony Holman buys it, he realizes this place is more valuable as a sporting center than as a housing development or as an airport. The land, again, because of all the tradition and the races, it's not just nostalgia. It's this sense of like, there is value in the sporting stories that have been made here for the last 20 years or so. So that's my rambly way of saying, I do hope that we start to learn more about these other speedways, because I had to kind of piece it together from newspapers and like some websites that are out there to try to figure out what was going on at Omaha and these other places. And there's all these tracks that almost get built. I mean, you can find newspapers where they're going to build one at Louisville, they're going to build one at Philadelphia, Providence, Rhode Island, and some of them get built. You know, there's one down in Miami, Florida that gets destroyed in the hurricane of 1926.
Fisher
But I think
built
a lot
that,
of them
right?
built- What's
Is
that?
that Carl Fisher? Carl Fisher built that track, didn't he?
The board
In-
track.
in Miami?
Yeah, Bolton.
But
Yeah,
there's a lot that don't get built. So
But that we talk about the role of the speedway. That's where the speedway became sort of a symbol of the future, because so many communities looked to the success of Indianapolis and looked to the spectacle. And that's where a lot of those Chamber of Commerces, I think, started saying, hey, let's build one of those here. And, and then you get into the, we just mentioned, I think, Paul, you just said, the board tracks, they raised the spectacle of motor racing to an nth degree, because they were high banked, they were smooth, they were incredibly dangerous. They were also incredibly delicate, because, one spark could burn the place to the ground, or a hurricane could blow it away. But that idea that, Indianapolis had the speedway and it had the bricks and it had its own kind of thing. But then people saying, well, we could do that too, but just a little different, and, building, Sheep's Head Bay and Altoona and places like that, where it's the idea of what they saw in Indianapolis, but they wanted to kind of put their own kind of spin on it. And unfortunately, for a lot of, you had dirt tracks and things, but for a lot of the big spectacles, you had those board tracks that were, just
ephemeral.
just a completely different animal altogether. And they didn't last. Indianapolis has weathered a whole lot of storms and is still successful. I don't know of many airports where you walk through the terminal and you see race cars.
Yeah.
I guess
Hartsville International was built on the Atlanta Speedway. Two things. One, Mark knows this. Harold Brasington said the Darlington Speedway was influenced directly by what he saw in Indianapolis. And also, throwing this over in Paul's lap, if we take that dot and push it across the water, you have Tripoli, you have Monza, you have the Nürburgring, you have Montejarre, you have all these European little speed palaces as well, capitals of speed. And so it's not just an American phenomenon, although I think it's been overlooked, as you correctly point out, Brian, to the point where I 25 years ago, I knew a little bit, and I spent 25 years digging into what into those things, and I still find stuff all the time when I go through a motor age or an automobile, like where did that come from, and so forth. But again, I think, Paul, that's one of the things that again fascinating, because that's architecture. It represents an ideology in many instances. Although when the Nürburgring was added afterwards, was built before the National Socialists. But Tripoli is another example. That is very much influenced, I would say, by Indianapolis, to be perfectly honest, when you take a look at it. And as Brian has correctly pointed out, when you start looking at these integral pieces, suddenly you're finding, as historians, wow, we have got a lot to do on this. I mean, graduate students, it's an open field. It really is. You can shoot 360 degree and you'll find a topic that very little has been done. So anyway,
Well, and speedways are such an important part. I mean, we look at them as being the venue where the cars and the stars do their thing. But when you think about, as Brian, shows us in his book, when you think about what the track itself meant to the region, meant to the economy, meant to the government, meant to the area where it was built. And then you can just kind of extrapolate from there. What about Darlington in South Carolina? What did Daytona do for Daytona Beach? I'm from northeastern Pennsylvania, Pocono. The Mattiolis bought a spinach farm and had had a three-cornered triangular track built that was actually had one turn modeled directly after Indianapolis. And the idea of, from that speedway and from that event, whatever race it happens to be, you branch out and you see the impact and the effect on, as Don, you just said, 360 degrees around that region. And it's so much more than just, the car racing is important, but boy, then you can go off in so many different directions and look at the influence of these places, and not only the influence on the sport, but the influence on where these things were built and what they meant to those regions.
More story time. I was told, and Brian, I want you to understand this. I was told many, many a time by people who were auto racing historians that a lot of things did not exist. For instance, the racing rules to the Automobile Club of America. I found them. An automobile magazine in 1901 and the amendments in 1902. I found the first 1903 rules by the AAA Racing Board that were done. I was told they didn't exist. On and on and on. But I think that's the academics. We dig, we're persistent. But we also leave a trail of breadcrumbs, because that's what I may find important. I think, and that's what I like about your book. Someone can pick your book up and continue to march. That is important. Same thing with Paul. Same thing what you've done, Mark. We can pick these works up and we have breadcrumbs, because we run into brick walls on occasion. The fact that Paul told me that there was not a book, even in Italian, on the relationship between fascists and the fascistas and the motorsport.
There is one book in Italian. One book.
Yeah, but
Published in
I mean,
2011.
wow! Out of
Yeah.
how many on Italian racing? I've got shelves of these books, and that just blew my mind. Yet now we have, and again, I keep going back to it, a book that lays it out. Can people go and do more work? Of course. We open doors. Paul has opened the door. Brian, you've opened the door. God, Mark, you've opened many, many, many doors for people. So this is why I think this is why the Argensinger Symposium exists. To have these discussions, to have these people who are buffs, but are darn good historians. They come up with topics I would have never imagined, and personalities that when you start piecing those pieces together, suddenly you have a clear idea. I mean, how many times we had someone talking about a European topic? Well, we had the Italians with some years ago that I was blown away. There were things, I know a lot about Italian racing, I thought, until they showed up. And then they just went into things. I was thinking, how did I miss that? Not necessarily because they don't read Italian very well. It's the fact that their brains were looking at those things and saying, there's more to this. That's what Paul did. And that's what you did, Brian, on that. Because
And
again, where do you go next? That's one of my questions. Where do you go next with this in motorsport?
that's a good question. I was going to say something different, but I'm not sure the answer to that question. Um, I was just going to say that, um, there's this. I think that I wish that mainstream historians would take things like sport more seriously.
Oh, definitely.
Here's the reason. I think back to that Amy Bass roundtable that you mentioned earlier. I remember reading that when it came out. I would have loved to have been part of that discussion in the Journal of American History. But there's this great book by a retired historian at Princeton, a guy named Dan Rogers, who wrote a book called Atlantic Crossings, and it's all about like liberal progressivism in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and these Americans who went to Germany and they studied in German universities, and people who went to England and learned about the social settlements, and they came back and they did a lot of these things in the United States. But one of the things we've been talking about is how something like that is happening with auto racing and automotive spectacle, because yeah, the people in Europe are paying attention to Indianapolis, but where did Carl Fisher get his idea in the first place? He sees Brooklands in England. He sees what they're doing there, and he says we should have one of those back in Indianapolis. And I guess one way you could take that is you could say, okay, well, we should be looking at kind of these international, transnational, cross Atlantic kind of connections with sport. But I think again, sport is not just telling us something about sport. It's telling us something about how people are using their time, what they're investing in, what they're investing their money in, but also their enjoyment. And auto racing, again, I think Mark put it really well, is that the story of Indianapolis, it's not just about the cars, it's not just about the races, but it's about all the other things that are going on around them. What the spectators are seeing, but also how are they getting there, and how the cities are put together and things like that. So I mean, I'd be really happy if we kept thinking along those lines and we said, okay, I mean, the racing itself is a really important thing that we need to understand, but what does it tell us about everything that's going on around those racetracks as well?
I think, Mark, you said one time, the most important thing about motor racing is not the cars and the tracks, it's all the stuff around it. Yeah, and it's the cultural aspect. By the way, you reminded me of something. I just came across this after looking for it for like about 5 years now. Sport, a Cultural History by Dr. Richard Mandel, who was one of my professors in graduate school. This is back when sport history, you could do Olympics and you could do baseball in America, and football was coming along, and you could do cricket, football, soccer, in Olympics in Europe. And he really lays it out quite well. So that's a very good point. And I just, there's just so many things that where we need to go with this. Uh, thank goodness for the Arkansas singer, because every year, something pops up that surprises me.
Well, and what I like too, this since we'll throw Dan in here sort of in absentia, one of the points that he made one time is that the thing about racetracks is that, as opposed to road racing, and especially in the old days of like the Glidden Tour and things like that, and the Vanderbilt Cup, where you had kind of point to point sort of racing, having an enclosed course meant fans had something to see. They could stand by the fence or sit in a grandstand and watch the cars go around and around repeatedly. And it was actually entertainment. It was more than just watching a car go by in a cloud of dust and that's it. Suddenly you had this kind of creation of an economy. Well, you had to buy a ticket to get the seat. And then while you're watching the races, you're probably going to get thirsty. So you could buy something to drink. And here's a program that tells you who's out there racing. And everything just kind of blossoms out of that idea of, how do we make something where people have something to watch, where they're going to sit here and have hours of entertainment. And that to me is fascinating, that idea that, and that's what Indianapolis, still does. I mean, the idea that, yeah, the races are exciting, but there are things there for people to do. There's everything from, the VIP suites to, the snake pit. But there's something for everybody, and if, whatever floats your boat, as they say.
I think you've hit on an
I
important idea. If you don't mind me just jumping in, it's a way to commodify the race, right? It's hard
boom.
to commodify. It's hard to charge tickets for a road race. You could do it, but it's hard. Whereas with a closed course, like you said, you could control access to the stands, but you can also watch the person go by again and again and again. And what's interesting then is it's not just the race itself is commodified, but the racers too can become celebrities, can become commodified celebrity. And there's one place in the book where I'm not a big Marxian, but there's kind of a Marxian moment where I say something like this is basically how automobility becomes commodified, right? That it gets turned into
Bingo. Yeah.
a use value, right? Or market value. That it goes from like, okay, you can watch cars to like, oh, we can like make money off of charging people to watch the symbolism of cars go by again and again and again. And I think that's hugely important. I think Dan's exactly right about that. That the closing the course, which I think is sort of an American innovation, that really it commodifies the event. So
Yeah, and you see that right about 1901, 1902, particularly about then, because the relationship motor racing culture in America, you have to understand bicycle racing, and you have to understand the two forms of horse racing, harness racing and thoroughbred racing, which are different rules and different organizations, which again, my ignorance was only exceeded by my lack of knowledge on that. Uh,
So
you see that it's entertainment. Basically, racing motorsport is a sport. I keep talking, I see it as a sport, less as a technical thing. I mean, people get 99% of the books seem to be about gear ratios and bores and strokes and tire sizes and stuff. I'm more fascinated in what Paul wrote about. I want to know, how did this ideology accommodate this thing? The Mila Migla. Holy moly, try to explain that outside of and the on and on and on. Yeah,
so
Paul.
yeah, thanks, Don. Yeah, so Brian, one thing about your book is when I finished reading it, I wanted to know more. I mean, is there a plan to kind of tell the rest of the story, 60s, 70s, and 90s, and or is that it?
Yeah.
I'll, I'll be honest, I don't have that plan.
Mhm.
I haven't said I'm not going to do that.
Yeah.
My first book was football. My second book
Mhm.
was auto racing. I've written a big chunk of my third book, and I hate to admit it's baseball, which is actually probably my favorite sport.
Hey,
And if you've been to Nash, you know that Nash used to be like all baseball and boxing. It's actually kind of it's weird. Like at a certain point, Nash was like, "Yeah, we're not really going to do baseball anymore. That's passe." And I'm like, "No, I think there's a new way of looking at the business of baseball, of organized baseball. That's kind of what I'm working on." But I suspect at some point I'm going to get pulled back into the story of 1960s, 1970s auto racing. I'll confess, a while back, Dan Nathan, who's the editor of the Journal of Sport History, asked me if I wanted to do. He's like, we never reviewed that movie, Ford versus Ferrari, when it came out. He's like, do you want to do a book review or a movie review? And at first, I misunderstood him. I thought he wanted me to review the book that's based on. Go Like Hell, I think is the title. And I said, well, I could do that. And I ended up reviewing both of them for the journal. And I loved the book. The movie was good too, but I really loved that book. And I was like, oh, there's some really interesting stuff going on in the 1960s in terms of automobiles. I think about my dad was, he owned a muscle car too in the 1960s. He had like a 1967 GPO, I think.
Mhm.
And part of me is like, now I want to know more about what was going on in auto racing more generally in the 60s. So I'm not saying I'm going to do that book, but it may pull me back in at some point in time. But for now, baseball is kind of where I'm going for the next big book project, at least. But yeah,
And there's that international sort of, combination that we see in motorsports. I think about the 1965 Indianapolis 500. You've got a Lotus powered by a Ford engine, driven by a Scotsman, and the people servicing the car are a NASCAR pit crew from Virginia. And they go on to dominate the Indianapolis 500 and win. And yeah, and people don't find that interesting. Historians don't see that as having some level. There's some fascination there with how all of those pieces came together at that particular point in time. It boggles the imagination. Of course,
5 minutes, gentlemen, 5 minutes.
I'm kind of a one-trick pony, but that those kinds of stories, and Indianapolis is really such a hotbed for those kinds of stories.
Because it seems that in the 60s, with the British, innovation comes back. I'm not an expert on Indy 500 history, but it would just be interesting to see that, now you get into the 60s, you have the museum, you have the whole nostalgia, you got the invented traditions like the drinking of the milk and all that, which I think you also bring out brilliantly in your book. So yeah, so it'd just be interesting to see what direction how that goes in the 60s. So.
And didn't they they are in the process of rebuilding or remodeling the museum at Indianapolis?
Yeah, it's shut down for a while. It will not be open. They're cleaning house to a large extent for various reasons. Mostly because they found that they had all the stuff that had nothing to do with Indianapolis Speedway in the race, or Indianapolis for that matter. And so that's basically where it stands right now. Jason Van Sickle is leading that effort. Jason is one of the really good guys, as far as I'm concerned. He's done a super job there. And I had to get it off because exactly what Paul said. The mystic chords of memory, the transformation of tradition in American culture. Don't drop it on your foot all these years later. And it's so I have this whole bunch of books that I keep Brian keeps, that I keep going back to. And it all seemed to be just like Mark and I's relationship started, on with the word culture. I mean, our official mission for the Arkansas Senior is the first turn meets the cultural turn. And that's what we've tried to push for years and years and years now. Mike thought it was funny. But after he thought about it, he said, that's pretty much what we're talking about. Because when you look at Watkins over the years, it's a cultural site. It really, that's a village of only a couple thousand people, and then you have over 100,000 people show up on a weekend. When first time I went there, I just came back from Europe, and it was maybe 20,000, and that was a huge crowd. Then it got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And the last one I went to sometime, I guess like 79, 80, whenever it was, nobody batted an eye that it was like 75 or 80,000 in this little village whose sole purpose, like Indianapolis, was a race.
And to bring all those foreign teams to that little hamlet, and that was just expected. And that's what you did. That was on the schedule, and you showed up, and nobody batted an eye about that.
I had people in the UK would see something with me and said, "You know where Watkins Glen is?" "Yeah, I go there all the time." They started talking about it. Said, "My one trip to America to a race was at Watkins." And they still talk about that. So anyway, I think we're getting close to time. Any closing remarks?
Just looking forward to seeing you all you guys virtually and in person in a week or so.
Absolutely.
So thank you for this great talk.
Thank you all for reading and inviting me here. I appreciate it a lot. Thank you.
Stay a part of the group. You're always welcome. Believe me.
Thank you for writing this book, Brian.
Oh, yeah.
It
Thanks, Brian.
it's changed our outlook on a lot of things, I think, or at least supported and has kind of bolstered up our feelings about that relationship between culture and motorsport. And likewise, real quickly, I'm sorry I'm not going to see everybody in person, but I will be lurking around in a virtual digital form there somewhere over the weekend, and I hope everyone has safe travels getting to and from the track. So
thank you, Paul, as always. Thank you, Brian. Of course, thank you, Mark. And Dan, I'm going to work Dan in somehow and all this. So thank you so much for taking your time. And again, it's always a pleasure to talk with you guys. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Brian, for joining us. So thank you, guys. I hope we didn't ruin your lunch.